writers, you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business, coming to you from Kobo's headquarters in Toronto. Hello and welcome to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. I'm Chrissy.
And I'm Stephanie. And in today's episode, we have another Kobo in conversation with best-selling author Ben Macintyre, where we talked to him about his new book, The Spy and the Traitor, and the interview was actually conducted by Globe and Mail's Doug Saunders. And this book is nonfiction, and is said to be the best true spy story I have ever read by
Jean Le Carré, none less than a true crime aficionado himself, spy writer, and it really encapsulates that story that you can, read any newspaper these days and feel like truth can truly be stranger than fiction. So we really enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you do too.
Well, thank you, everyone, and welcome here. A big welcome for Ben, who's not looking jet lagged at all.
No, not yet. Give it another hour and I'll go.
Speaking of jet lag, I owe a moment of pain recently to you. I flew to Berlin a couple weeks ago and had several intense days of briefings and so on. And I'd arrived and got off the plane. I got to my hotel about 1 a.m. or something like that, and I thought, okay, I'm jet lagged. I need to get to sleep. So I thought, why don't I pick up this spy book? And I just read a couple of pages and fall asleep. And 3.5 hours later, the sun was rising, and I've reached the last page. I was a zombie for the next couple of days as a consequence. You've managed to write a nonfiction book about one of the great double agents of our age that is an absolutely great, but it's novelistic in its telling.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, I'm both sorry that I kept you awake and absolutely delighted. So
yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
And I had read his autobiography in the 1990s when it came out, which is itself fascinating, but this manages to break new ground. It's really fascinating.
Well, it does. It's interesting. I mean, when Oleg wrote his own memoir in 1996, he was under very close constraint. There was a lot that he couldn't say in there for sort of security reasons. There was also quite a lot he didn't actually know about how the case had been run. And one of the great pieces of good fortune I've had is that I've been able to talk to all of the MI6 officers who were Oleg's case officers for more than a decade. That's where the kind of warp and weft of this comes from, the sort of detailed spycraft. Because Oleg, there's no reason why he would have even known any of that.
So let me just try to set the context here for you. In the post-World War II history of spying, there are sort of three great double agents / traitors who were high enough level and serious enough about what they were doing to have betrayed their entire country's deepest secrets. The first was Kim Philby, the British spy who in the 1940s basically gave away most of Britain's and America's secrets to the Soviet Union and was the subject of Ben's previous book, A Spy Among Friends. And then the third in the list was Aldrich Ames, the American CIA agent who in the 1980s managed to give basically all of America's top secrets to the Soviet Union for money. And then, of course, you have this figure in the middle, Oleg Gordievsky, who was eventually an absolutely top-level KGB official working in Britain who managed to give all of the Soviet Union's greatest spy secrets to Britain and indirectly to the United States. Now, what fascinates me about what the way you've woven this book is that these are not unrelated figures. Oleg Gordievsky is sort of the man in the middle of the three of them. He personally knew Kim Philby, who had fled to Moscow by then and was briefing spies there on tradecraft and so on. And he personally met Aldrich Ames as well, who eventually betrayed him and caused another adventure that we'll get into.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, there's a sort of strange historical line that links all three of them. And interestingly, it was Philby who very nearly managed to expose Oleg right at the beginning of his time as a double agent, because this is to leap ahead of the story a little bit, but one of the Soviet agents, one of the KGB spies that Oleg had identified in Scandinavia, was arrested. and the KGB set up its own internal investigation to try and work out what had gone wrong, and the person in charge of that was Kim Philby, who was brought out of retirement in Moscow to see if he could work out what had happened. And the old fox, he worked it out. He didn't work out who it was, but he went back to the KGB head of that directorate and said, you've got a mole in your midst. And at that point, all the officers were gathered in together, including Oleg, to hear, we think there's a spy in our midst, and it's probably someone in this room. And that was Philby who'd managed to work that out. So, he very nearly did for him very early on.
It's extraordinary. This sort of web of connections between the. I mean, this is a spy who managed to sort of touch all of the leading figures of the time. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, of course, was addicted to his leaked documents and was reading them every morning.
Although she never knew his real identity until the...
What did she call him?
She called him Mr. Collins. Why she called him Mr. Collins, we've never been able to work out. It was just one of her idiosyncrasies. I mean, Thatcher didn't really like spies on the whole. She thought they were sort of slightly grubby creatures. But she really valued Gordievsky because I think she knew, well, two things. She knew, first of all, that the material he was producing was of a hugely high value, and that gave Britain the chance to punch way above its weight with the state, so it was able to pass on a lot of very good information. And I think she also knew, and indeed she said to her biographer, that she felt that he was taking such a huge personal risk doing what he was doing. I mean, it's a contrast with Philby. I mean, if Philby had been caught, he might have been tried, I doubt it. I think he would probably have just been put out to grass. If Oleg had been caught, he would have been arrested, interrogated, tortured, and then shot in the back of the head. Mm-hmm. I mean, the penalty for what he was doing was summary execution.
And he came that close.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he came that close. I mean, he was kind of it came down to about 80 seconds in the end.
Yeah, literally. I mean, among the many sort of extraordinary novelistic narratives in this, of course, the most famous one is he was half found out when he was just about to become the station chief in London, flown back to Moscow with his wife and children, and he was placed under house arrest, drugged and interrogated.
It was a terrible moment. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, at that point in his career, he'd now by this point, I mean, he arrived in Britain in 1981. He began effectively just emptying the safe of the KGB station and handing it all over to MI6. And then he began to ascend up through the ranks of the KGB, partly because the Brits kept throwing out his bosses. I mean, they kept declaring persona non grata, the people immediately above him, so that he would then be promoted into I mean, when they look back on it, it was a pretty obvious pattern.
He was creating the circumstances of his own story. Another great narrative in this is that it turns out that MI6 said, we need to make this man a powerful KGB agent. And not only should we spread poisonous rumors about all his superiors and bosses being spies so that they can get booted out of the country and he can rise up the ranks, but we need to make him a Soviet super spy, and we need to feed him really good stuff that looks secret.
And more than
they had a whole operation to create political officials in Britain who could leak stuff to him that would be valuable to the Kremlin.
And these were real people. These were people who thought they were dealing with a Soviet spy and thought that they were being told by MI5 to pass on various bits of information. What they didn't realise was they were passing on genuine bits of information, nothing that was going to sort of affect national security, but they were effectively filling his bag with stuff that he could then report back to Moscow, and he would then be thought to be doing an even better job. So he did really well, and he'd become appointed as head of the KGB in London. And then when he was summoned back, and we can explain what had happened in the build-up to his being summoned back, there was a huge debate within MI6 about whether or not he should go back. And there were voices saying he's done a noble job, he should be allowed to kind of retire with honour, he should have a false identity created for him and he should never have to work again. There were other voices saying, we're on the verge of a jackpot here. If he becomes head of the KGB in London, we'll have access to everything. And it was a finely tuned debate, and I've spoken to everyone who was in that room. And it was Oleg himself who made the choice, who in the end decided to go back. And it's a kind of interesting moment because it was one of those moments when two sets of people can hear the same thing, but interpret it in completely different ways. Oleg believed he was really being instructed to go back. most of them in the room thought that he was being given a genuine choice. But it was incredibly brave.
The Brits thought they were saying to him, "No, don't go back to Russia. You're going to be arrested and shot." He thought they were saying to him, "It's probably all right to go back."
Go back.
It's interesting. If I can caricature that a little bit.
Memory plays funny tricks.
Yes.
I mean, I think on both sides, it probably wasn't as simple as that.
You interviewed all the key figures, including Gordievsky himself, for
many.
Quite some time.
Yeah, I mean, Oleg still lives in a safe house in Britain, where he's been for 33 years now.
Quite a nice safe house, I imagine.
He doesn't live in any great style. It's actually very anonymous, I mean, for obvious reasons.
Yes.
I mean, if you walk down the street and somebody said to you, identify the house that has a Russian spy in it, well, actually, you'd probably be able to do it because it stands out a mile. It's so inconspicuous.
I used to live in North London, and half the houses there looked like a Russian spy.
Absolutely, but he's
only about a third of them did, though.
But he's under intense security now. I mean, particularly since what happened in Britain in March, since the attempted poisoning of Sergei Skripal, he is now under the most intensive security. I mean, you wouldn't get anywhere near
This is another one of the great paradoxes of this, of course, is that we're now in another, I wouldn't say golden age, but another apex period of international espionage.
Yeah. Well, I
tricks.
promise I didn't know that was going to happen when I started this book. I mean, it's suddenly every headline seems to make it.
Yeah, and he's both object and subject. I mean, you actually quote Putin figures very recently saying, well, if we were going to kill someone, it wouldn't be this guy we poisoned; it would be Gordievsky.
Well, I mean, he was tried in absentia. I mean, when he escaped, not to give the story away, but when he got away to the West, he was tried by a military court and sentenced to death. And that execution order is still in force. It's never been rescinded. And Putin himself has a personal reason for hating Gordievsky. I mean, he doesn't approve of people who turn against the state anyway, but he was a young KGB officer himself in Leningrad when Oleg was exfiltrated, and all of his bosses and patrons were fired as a result. And so his own career, Putin's career, it is said, went through a bad dip as a result of Oleg's defection.
So he even angered Putin at a very early age.
age.
So an example of the sort of narrative detail in this, because this is not a work of analysis. This is not as an unknown story being revealed for the first time. There have been many books, including by Gordievsky himself. This is a work that takes what we thought we knew all about and reveals the extraordinary colorful detail in it. I think just a tiny little micro item of detail that sort of illustrates how well. So yes, he was about to be executed in Moscow, seemingly an impossible situation with hundreds of KGB guards roaming the streets outside his house. And somehow the British diplomats resident in Moscow executed a plan that had existed for a decade.
Well, let's explain the plan, because it's such a weird plan.
Well, let me start with the detail, because at a certain point, he's been removed from Moscow, and he's being driven toward the Finnish border in a Saab. He's actually ended up. It involves him picking an odd moment to decide to have a couple drinks in the middle of the countryside of northwestern Russia, and then runs 16 kilometers to this point on the highway where the two Saabs being driven by British diplomats and their baby, just to make it look innocent, stops. He takes off his clothes and climbs into because they may be radioactive, in order to trace the KGB sprinkled radioactive dust on his clothes in his house so they can track him. Climbed mostly naked into the trunk of this Saab. They've thrown in a reflective blanket on him to throw off the heat, given him a bottle of water, shut it, and he's basically, then the British diplomats inadvertently tortured him for about 10 hours by way of, he's sitting in the trunk of the car, bathed in sweat, which is dripping into the trunk of the car, boot, as you would call it. And they decide that the music they'll play is, he's an aesthetically motivated man. He loves Elgar, he loves classical music, he loves high culture, and so on. And what the British diplomats decide to play is their favorite cassette, which is Dr. Hook's Greatest Hits, at great volume, blasting into the trunk for 10 hours. And
he's still very cross about that. I mean, he still says it was terrible music. I don't know why I had to listen to this all the way to the Finnish border. But I mean, the escape is pretty extraordinary, actually. I mean, to go back a stage, long before that moment, 7 years before, Oleg had said to his MI6 handlers, I need an escape plan. You need to frame some way that will get me out of Russia, which had never been attempted before. No one had ever escaped from Soviet Russia, let alone a KGB officer who would probably be under surveillance. And so they framed up this extraordinary escape plan called Operation Pimlico, which came straight out of the pages of John le Carré. Mm-hmm. I mean, actually, in fact, I think it probably did come straight from fiction because apart from, police and mafia, there's no group of people in the world that are more interested in their own mythology than spies. And the people in MI6, I think, read a lot of John le Carré. And the escape plan went like this. Oleg had to be seen on a particular corner of a particular street in Moscow at 7:30 on a Tuesday night holding a Safeway bag.
Yeah.
That was the escape signal. And the signal that it had been picked up by MI6 was that an MI6 officer would walk past him holding a Harrods bag and eating an English chocolate bar. It had to be either a Mars bar or a Kit Kat. And for 7 years, every Tuesday, that signal site was monitored by MI6. And they went around with their pockets full of Kit Kats. They honestly, a couple of them told me they'd never going to eat another Mars bar in their lives. They were so sick of it. But the extraordinary thing was that they kept the system of monitoring this site, even when Oleg wasn't in Moscow. Because they themselves, the diplomats, MI6 guys, were themselves under surveillance. And so, therefore, they couldn't change the pattern of their behaviour, i.e., if they began only monitoring the site when Oleg was in Moscow, that would be that would be something that the KGB would pick up. So even when he wasn't there, rain, snow, wind, it didn't matter. Somebody had to be on that corner at 7:30 on a Tuesday night looking for a man who they'd never seen before, bear in mind. They had no idea what he looked like. They had one grainy photograph. A man holding a Safeway bag,
so
which is exactly what happened.
If you'd been any sort of British diplomat posted in Moscow in the mid to late 70s or 80s, you would have had engaged in this odd ballet of accumulating Harrods bags and Kit Kat bars.
Only if you were MI6.
Yes, if you were actually MI6.
I mean, they were under diplomatic cover, so they were posing as if they were kosher diplomats, but they weren't. There were only two of them. And their wives were on it as well, because the wives or husbands of serving MI6 officers are treated, and still are treated, as if they're sort of ex officio unpaid members of the intelligence
Quite
service.
a contrast from the KGB.
Quite a contrast from the KGB. And then there was one secretary. So it was quite a rota. I mean, every single Tuesday night they had to be watching this place.
And in fact, one of these spouses helped evade capture, right, by as they were crossing the Finnish border and it looked like the KGB were about to come up and search the car. She decided to place her baby on the...
Well, yeah, that's the most bizarre
boot,
part of
and
the
change
story.
the nappy, which happened to be filled at that moment.
Yeah, and the owner of that dirty nappy is now 34 and is head of Russian art at Sotheby's.
What a story to tell.
I couldn't put that in the book because it would have identified her too clearly.
Yeah.
She's fantastically proud of the fact that her full nappy changed. What happened was this, it was a very bizarre moment because they were driving, there were 4 different checkpoints at the Finnish border. And they'd got through the first 2, and they were waiting at the third one when the Soviet border guards' sniffer dogs began to go around the boot of the car. And as you said, Oleg was incredibly hot in the back there. They had to wrap him in this infrared reflective blanket because there were infrared cameras at the borders that would have picked up the profile without it. But it was boiling hot. It was the middle of July, and he was sweating like mad. And the dogs began to circle round the back of the car, clearly sensing that there was something in the boot. And as you say, the wife of the head MI6 officer, a completely ad hoc thing, it had never been planned, this obviously, because you couldn't plan for the baby to fill her nappy, had just done so and realised there was an opportunity, took the baby out, put her on the boot, and dropped the nappy on top of one of the dogs, which then went... Right. And the smell masked what was in the boot of the car.
Because she'd been smelling this smelly, slightly inebriated Russian double agent in the car.
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, they talk very feelingly about the fact that they were very worried that he was going to be picked up. I mean, it was touch and go. I mean, it was down to seconds, that bit.
It's extraordinary, and this is just full of these sort of details. I think we can open to audience questions now.
Sure.
Do any of you have any questions?
Please, fire away. Anything. Yes.
I'm just curious about how did you gain access to interview and meet this person, and then also, can you ever go to Russia?
The answer to the second question is certainly not at the moment. I don't think I'd be very welcome.
You're not going to have a book tour there, no.
Actually, funnily enough, well, that's a different story. But in fact, I was contacted by, believe it or not, there is a head of history at the Russian intelligence service who was very helpful with this book. Actually, a man called Bogdanov. I got an email from him the other day. He'd read the book, saying, casting a very interesting light on it, and saying that this book should be published in Russia. I slightly doubt it will be under the first circumstances. But the reason I got access, well, it's been a long process. I mean, I started about 5 years ago, and in fact I contacted Oleg because I wanted to talk to him about a completely different case. And we got to be friendly, really. And in those days, I could visit him in the safe house without too much difficulty. I had to tell MI6 I was going and what time I would be there, but it wasn't impossible to do. It would be very, very difficult to do now. But it's an interesting question of why I was allowed to do it, because all of the case officers that have spoken to me about this, they've all broken the Official Secrets Act, which is I've signed it too. It's the thing that you sign that says you'll never reveal, stuff that you've discovered in the course of your work. They've all broken it. And they were all allowed to speak to me, and they wouldn't have been allowed to do that unless MI6 had given them the say-so to do so. So to that extent, the intelligence service has kind of enabled me to do this. That said, it's had no control over the result. They've never read the manual. They can't change anything in it. But they could have stopped me, although they could have made it a very different book, and they didn't. So that's been great. And I probably totted them up the other day. I think I've got about 140 hours of recorded interviews with him. And he's extraordinary, Oleg, because one of the things they trained him in Soviet spy school, which was called the Red Banner Institute, School 101, which is just outside Moscow, one of the things they taught him was memorization techniques, how to kind of absorb huge amounts of documentary information and just commit it to memory, which makes him an extraordinary source, really, because even now, and he's 80 now, he can tell you what it smelled like in a particular room in the basement of the Lubyanka in 1968. And what's more, if you ask him the same question 3 weeks later, he'll tell you exactly the same thing. So in that sense, he's a quite unique source. I've never met anybody quite like him.
I wonder, with looking at your body of work, and it feels like there's a particular form of statecraft and spycraft that you're probing, and it's all very much of the 20th century. I wonder, with I'm not sure if the Cold War ended or if it just changed temperature or something like that, right? Do you see a 21st century Ben Macintyre book out there? Or is that just, are things different now that it's Russian hackers?
Is stuff happening right now that's of this caliber?
Well, there's a two-part, that's a very good question. There's a two-part answer to it, really. One is that, yes, I mean, spycraft has changed beyond all recognition. It's a lot of it is about signals intelligence now. It's about eavesdropping on telephone conversations, picking up texts, electronic monitoring. So the shift has moved that way. On the other hand, human intelligence, the sort of alternative branch, is just as important as it's ever been. If you look at the way those GRU officers were picked up in the Netherlands a couple of weeks ago, they are humans operating machines. And so you still need humans to do that, and you need humans to spot them as well. And I'd have a bet with you, the reason why the Dutch were waiting at that airport is that there's somebody inside the GRU who is telling the West what's happening. So I think the GRU is probably having a major mole hunt at the moment.
There are things happening. Look what happened in Istanbul two weeks ago.
Those are people
somehow
doing
12 interesting guys from Riyadh showed up in two vans, possibly killed and chopped apart a guy or something like that. But also, somehow Turkey knew everything that was said inside the...
And apparently recorded it too, which is not a recording you'd like to hear.
Seems to have had people who could inform on.
So yes, I mean, I think the human intelligence element continues, absolutely. I mean, there's another parallel, which is that we seem to imagine that what the Russian state is doing at the moment is somehow a brand new set of kind of principles. It's straight out of the KGB playbook. I mean, one of Oleg's jobs when he first came to London in the 1980s was to try to influence the election. He was there to plant fake news, get hold of friendly journalists whom he could suborn and persuade to push a party line, try to encourage one party and discourage another by creating a whole blizzard of kind of stuff that so nobody could tell what was true and what wasn't. Is any of this sounding at all familiar?
A large part of what his KGB office on the top floor of the embassy in London was doing was creating fake news. They were writing complete nonsensical reports about probably the Conservative Party or something.
Absolutely, and they call it, I mean, it has a special term in Russian terminology, which was invented in the Stalinist era, in fact, which is active measures. Active measures are when you create a blizzard of what they call maskirovka, which means sort of disguise. So nothing is true and everything is possible. That's a very, very old KGB maxim, which is working brilliantly at the moment, because none of us really knows how that Skripal attack was carried out, the whole GRU assault on Western institutions. This is old-fashioned stuff. So in lots of ways spying has changed. Sorry, a very long answer to your question, but in lots of ways spying has changed unrecognisably. In others, it's absolutely the same old game.
I want to see if you think that the Russians have something on Trump. Maybe that's your book, Christopher Steele, or...
Well, yes. I mean, there's so many theories buzzing around about that. Were they doing compromat on him? That's the term, compromising material, trying to... Yes, of course. I mean, it would have been absolutely standard behaviour to film whatever went on in that hotel room. Is it exactly what was described in the dossier? My suspicion is it probably isn't. But again, that's an old KGB technique, which is that to do a compromat like that, you need quite a lot of people. You need probably somebody told me, you need probably about 50 people to carry out that kind of filming job. You need to bribe the doorman, you need to get in, you need to plant cameras, you need to know where he's coming, so you need eyes on the ground, you need electronics, and anything like that. So it's quite a lot of people. And they would have done it by routine, never thinking that Trump was ever going to be a candidate for president. But it's useful stuff, So then they face a problem come the election. This is a theory. This isn't my theory. This is one that I've been told by people in MI6. And it's only a theory. But so then the election comes along, and they've got this lump of slightly smelly material. They don't know what it is. I don't think it is hookers urinating on the beds, but clearly something happened in that hotel room. So what do they do with it? Well, my feeling is they probably fed it to Steele in a kind of odd form, some of which was deniable and some of which wasn't. Deliberately, so that Trump could then stand up and say, this is all a pack of lies, it's all been made up, while knowing that some of it was true. And the phrase they've used to me is, he has a stone in his shoe. He knows, this is again just a theory, I stress, but that there is a potentially very nasty piece of information that is waiting to come out, which is perfect compromise. That's how it works. The victim knows that you've got something on him, and you'll probably behave quite well if you know that, or do whatever you tell him. So sorry, that's a long answer. But
it was a decade before the broad outlines of this case were known.
Absolutely.
And really, it's only now that the full narrative is able to be put together.
Yeah.
So we may be in a situation where, in our dotage, we're all in whatever sort of air raid shelter or atmospheric retirement home we have to be in. We'll start reading some equally extraordinary
maybe.
tales
It'll be interesting. Although the records, it'd be interesting to know how they're keeping the records, because it is all now digital and therefore very sort of vulnerable to both manipulation and to loss. So it's hard to know how the intelligence historians of the next century will operate, because it's going to be a tricky time.
But you did this without having access to any MI6 files.
Yeah, nobody gets.
You
access
relied
to
on human intelligence,
Absolutely.
aka interviews, entirely for this.
Yeah, almost entirely. There's a little bit of, there's some stuff from MI5, which is the security service. There's nothing from MI6 because their archives are sealed and will never be opened. Right. They have good reasons for that. But yeah, so it does depend on it,
people telling their stories.
People telling you their stories, which has been wonderful actually, because you then get this kind of pattern of memory, which allows you to kind of work out what is the actual course of events.
Hi.
Hello.
And I think you just answered this a little bit, but why open up to you? What makes you unique? And maybe would you consider that people were trying to influence, although they couldn't change the commas and the paragraphs in your text, but the overall thrust? Why open up to you?
Well, look, if this is a case they are proud of, is a good answer, part of it. Had Oleg not escaped, had he been caught at the border and shot, I wouldn't be sitting here telling you this story, because they would never have let it get out. So it reflects well on the intelligence services, so that's a good reason why. Why me? I don't know really. I think they didn't encourage me to do it. In fact, initially they were quite anxious about it. Only latterly did it become clear that they really were kind of not going to stand in the way. But it was a kind of negative form of help. They never tried to steer it at all. The officers did. They had the former officers, they had a very clear view about what they thought they'd done and what the principles were and why it worked. But the latter-day MI6 office had nothing to do with it at all. And in fact, I rather respect them for that. They let it go. Once the Skripal poisoning had happened, they then became pretty anxious. And actually I did too, because I began to wonder, gosh, have I put Oleg have I made his life that much more dangerous? Have I put him under greater jeopardy? inadvertently, by writing this book that was going to draw more attention to him. He's incredibly insouciant about that. I mean, he's seen death from pretty close up. I mean, he came so close to being killed in 1985 that I don't think he thinks this is any extra threat to him, because he's lived with that for a very long time. But yes, I never felt steered at all on this. I'm glad to say. I would have felt very uncomfortable if I had been. And I have no link to the intelligence services at all. It's I have an indirect link through some of the case officers, but I don't know anybody there at the moment. So.
Thank you for coming, Ben
Pleasure.
and Doug.
Thank you.
So we hope you enjoyed this Kobo and conversation with Ben Macintyre.
Yep, we always love sharing the conversations that happen here at Kobo HQ that you might not find on other writing podcasts, and find some inspiration if you're maybe incorporating some spy subplots into your book. You might have gained some inspiration from listening to this one.
Some government secrets.
Ooh. I wanted to take this moment to give a friendly reminder when you're setting your ebook price, or if you already have books live in the Kobo store, that you can set custom prices per currency, and we do give some handy suggestions for rounding to the nearest 0.99 in most currencies. I'm often surprised by some pretty high up there authors making the mistake of just entering a USD price and letting the system convert the rest. That creates some awkward pricing, like $6.53 in Canada, which is a pretty huge market for us and for most of you. So take that minute, go to set the price, and you can customize your prices for all of our geos and hopefully increase your sales, because the pricing will be more appealing to our merchandisers and our customers.
You can also do this for a scheduled price change. Don't forget, you can fill out all the different currencies for those as well.
Yep, if you're opting to drop your price in other geos. Thanks as always for listening. If you like this podcast, tell a friend about it, or take a minute to leave us a rating or review. We truly appreciate it, and we hope you will tune in next time to the Kobo Writing Life podcast.
Thanks, guys. Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we provide insights and stories from leaders and experimenters in the world of self-publishing.
If you want even more information about growing your Kobo sales, check out our blog or find us on social.
And if you're just finding us and ready to start your self-publishing journey today, sign up for free at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing!